You've heard the stories of abandoned ships, of ancient secrets, of things that should never have been found. But some still seek them out, and they find. At first they laughed, but then they started to disappear. You don't put on that armor, they put on you.
The wreck drifted in the vast black like a carcass abandoned to the tides of the void. Twisted metal and shattered hull plating glowed faintly under the light of distant stars, the ship's ruined structure frozen in a silent scream. Kane Vale sat in the cockpit of his own vessel, Iron Fang, staring at the wreckage through the reinforced glass. He had been searching for weeks. Rumors whispered of an ancient battlefield where forgotten warships floated like tombstones in the abyss. He didn't care about history. He cared about what might be left behind. Technology, weapons, anything that could give him an edge. Because out here, strength was the only thing that mattered. And humans? Humans were weak. No matter how hard he trained, no matter how many fights he took, the galaxy saw him as nothing more than a fragile creature from a fragile world. An amusement, something to bet against. Not anymore. With a slow breath, he disengaged the autopilot and guided his ship through the debris field. Jagged fragments of metal drifted past like the bones of some massive, long-dead beast. His scanner flickered with interference, static warping the readings. That was a bad sign. Wrecks this old should have been stripped clean centuries ago, yet this one still pulsed with something. Something wrong. Kane suited up and stepped into the airlock. The hiss of decompression filled his ears, the artificial voice of his helmet whispering status updates. Then, with a sharp release of pressure, the doors parted, and he was floating in the void. His suit's thrusters carried him toward the wreck. As he neared, he could make out what had once been the ship's name, half buried beneath layers of charred hull plating. The letters were unfamiliar, their sharp angles alien, but they pulsed faintly, as if alive. A deep unease slithered through his chest. He shook it off. The breach in the hull was wide enough for him to slip inside. As he passed through, the shadows swallowed him whole. Inside, the silence was absolute. His headlamp flickered against corroded metal, revealing long corridors caked in centuries of dust. The walls bore deep, claw-like gouges, though whether they came from battle or something else, he couldn't tell. The floor beneath him was littered with shattered remains, pieces of armor, weapons, bones stripped bare by time. The air, stale and unmoving, reeked of something beyond decay. Kane pressed forward. The ship's corridors twisted unnaturally, the architecture unsettling in ways he couldn't quite place. Corners bent at angles that hurt his eyes if he stared too long. Doorways stood just a little too tall, a little too narrow. Something had lived here once, something that wasn't human. His footsteps echoed as he entered a larger chamber. That was when he saw it. At the center of the room, half buried in a nest of skeletal remains, lay the armor. It wasn't like any war gear he had ever seen. It was organic. Dark, chitinous plating fused seamlessly with the skeletal remains of whatever had worn it before. Segmented ridges lined the back, stretching out like a second spine, and the chest plate was adorned with deep grooves, almost like veins. The moment his headlamp passed over it, the surface shifted, reacting to the light. His gut screamed at him to leave it alone. Instead, he reached out. The moment his fingers brushed against the plating, the armor moved. A cold, invasive sensation latched onto his skin, spreading like needles burrowing into his nerves. He gasped, his body seizing as the armor pulsed. Then the pain came, sharp and deep, like hooks tearing through his flesh. The plating expanded, coiling around his wrist, his forearm, his shoulder. It wasn't just attaching to him, it was merging. Kane fell to his knees, gasping as the cold fire of something other spread through his veins. His bones cracked, but he didn't scream. His muscles tensed, but he didn't fight it. Because in that moment, he felt something he had never felt before. Strength. Real, undeniable strength. And for the first time in his life, the idea of fear felt irrelevant. The arena reeked of sweat, blood, and oil. The crowd roared, a shifting sea of alien voices, their cries a mixture of amusement and expectation. They had seen this before, a human stepping into the pit, foolish and desperate, thinking he could compete with the true warriors of the galaxy. Kane stood in the center of the fighting ring, his armor gleaming under the harsh artificial lights. It had changed since he first put it on, refining itself, adapting to his body in ways he didn't fully understand. It felt like a second skin now, shifting subtly with every breath, tightening around his muscles like it knew what was coming. Across from him, his opponent loomed, a Varak warrior, a beast of muscle and plated scales. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, 4 arms coiled with tension, its lower jaw split into 2 mandibles that clicked in anticipation. Kane had seen this species fight before. They were relentless, able to tear through reinforced steel with their bare hands. The crowd loved them, and they expected Kane to die screaming. The announcer's voice thundered through the arena, his alien tongue twisting around Kane's name before spitting it into the air like an afterthought. A joke, a footnote in someone else's victory. Then the match began. The Varrock charged. Kane didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his heart beating slow, measured. The armor whispered beneath his skin, a sensation like a coiled predator waiting for its moment. At the last second, he moved. Not away, not back, but forward. He slipped under the first swing, the Varrock's massive fist whistling past his ear. The second strike came from the left, a downward hammer meant to crush him, but Kane's body twisted unnaturally, his spine bending at an angle no human should have been able to manage. He slid past the attack like liquid, his movements impossibly smooth, and for the first time in his life he understood. The armor wasn't just protecting him, it was guiding him. A sharp grin spread across his face as he lashed out, his fingers curling into a fist. Only he didn't punch. He pierced. His hand, clad in the black plating of his new skin, sank into the Varrock's throat. The warrior gurgled, eyes wide in shock as its own blood sprayed across the arena floor. The crowd fell silent. Kane ripped his hand free, dark ichor trailing from his fingertips. The Varrock staggered back, its powerful body trembling, its forearms grasping at the wound. But it was too late. The damage was done. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kane raised his blood-stained hand and curled his fingers. The crowd erupted. Their shock turned to exhilaration, to something primal and hungry. They had come to watch a human die, but instead they had seen something else, something new. Kane turned his gaze upward, scanning the crowd, watching the way they looked at him now. No longer a joke, no longer an afterthought. He had their attention, and he wasn't going to let it go. His opponent collapsed, its body twitching, its mandibles clicking weakly in death. The match was over, but Kane was just getting started. The smell of blood never left him now. It clung to his skin, to his armor, saturating the air of his quarters, no matter how many times he tried to scrub it away. The fights had become easier, too easy. The others were fast, strong, brutal. But they weren't him. They weren't wearing this thing that had become part of him, fusing deeper every day. Kane sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his reflection in the metal wall panel. His face still looked human, mostly, but there were changes. His skin was paler, his eyes darker, the veins beneath his flesh no longer just veins, but something else. They pulsed faintly, like shifting tendrils beneath the surface. He had stopped feeling pain in the fights. He had stopped feeling tired. Even the wounds that should have taken weeks to heal closed in minutes. That should have terrified him. It should have made him question what he was becoming. But all he could feel was the hunger. And now the disappearances had started. It began with a fighter, one of his rivals, a heavily armored war beast from a distant system. They had been scheduled to fight the next night. Instead, his quarters were found empty, his weapons left behind, his communicator still blinking on the table. No signs of struggle, no body. Then it was one of the arena's medics, then a sponsor, a few trainers. The others whispered about it in hushed voices. Some believed it was an inside job, an underground betting scandal, fighters being removed before they could climb too high. Others believed it was something worse. None of them suspected him. Not yet. Kane clenched his fists. The armor twitched in response, shifting along his arms, the plates flexing like muscle. It felt so natural now, more a part of him than his own skin. He barely even remembered what it had felt like before it had wrapped itself around his bones, before it had begun whispering. The sound wasn't voices, not words, just a faint clicking, like something shifting in the dark, growing louder when he was alone. That night he woke to the feeling of something moving beneath his ribs. Kine shot upright, his breath ragged, his body wrong. He clutched his chest, feeling the unnatural sensation spreading, twisting through him. His skin rippled under his touch, something shifting just beneath the surface, something alive. He stumbled to the mirror. His reflection looked back at him, his chest rising and falling, his breath heavy and uneven. Then, right before his eyes, the armor moved, not just the plating, but the flesh beneath it. His ribs stretched, the dark veins beneath his skin pulsing, his collarbone flexing like something inside him was testing its boundaries. His fingers curled against the metal sink, breath shuddering. His body was no longer just his own. The whispers in his skull grew louder, not words, just a hungry, pulsing noise. A sound that had no voice, no emotion, just need. And in the pit of his stomach, Kane realized something. The disappearances weren't a mystery. They were a memory, his own. The air in the corridors was thick with the stench of blood. It clung to the walls, to the floors, to him. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Guards, fighters, assassins, all torn apart with the same brutal precision. Their limbs were scattered like discarded pieces of meat, their faces frozen in expressions of horror they hadn't even had time to understand. Kane stood in the center of it all, his breath slow, measured. His hands, coated in crimson, twitched at his sides, the armor shifting with every subtle movement. It was no longer just a suit, no longer something he wore. It was him. It had finished merging, sculpting his body into something more, something beyond the limits of bone and flesh. His spine had lengthened, vertebrae reinforced by the living black plating that had once only covered his limbs. His fingers had elongated into talon-like appendages, the tips sharp enough to cut through metal. His skin was somewhere between flesh and chitin, the veins beneath pulsing with dark fluid. His teeth, he hadn't realized it until one of his kills, had sharpened, his jaw stronger than it had ever been. And worst of all, he wasn't afraid. He had never felt more alive. The assassins had come in the dead of night. He hadn't even needed to be awake when they arrived. The armor had sensed them first. It had moved before he had, twisting his body into the kill, before his mind had even processed the threat. He had woken up to the feeling of bone breaking beneath his grip, to the sound of blood splattering against the walls. The hunger had taken over after that. He hadn't fought them like a man. He had fought them like a thing. And now, standing amidst the carnage, his heart pounding, Kane realized something. There would be no more fights, no more victories. No one would dare challenge him now, not when they had seen this, not when they knew what he had become. But the armor wasn't satisfied. It had never been satisfied. Kane exhaled, lifting his hand, flexing his fingers as the black plating twisted with him, stretching, breathing. He could still feel it inside, growing, shifting beneath his skin, deeper than before. It wasn't just armor. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a seed. And now it had bloomed. A movement in the doorway caught his attention. Someone was still alive. A single figure, a young alien, one of the pit handlers. They had come to check the arena, to clean up after the matches, but now they were frozen in the entrance, wide-eyed, breath trembling. They had seen. Their hands trembled at their sides, their lips parted as if to scream, but no sound came out. Kane took a slow step forward. The alien flinched, pressing back against the wall as if that would stop him. But he didn't attack. He didn't need to, because he had already won. They would spread the word. They would tell the others what they had seen. The human who had changed, the warrior who had become something else. And just like that, he understood. He had set out to prove his strength, to make them respect him. Now they wouldn't just respect him, they would fear him. And the hunger would never stop. Kane smiled, his sharpened teeth catching the light. Then he stepped into the darkness and disappeared.